Joining us now, NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles, Punchbowl News co-founder and MSNBC political contributor Jake Sherman, and New York Times opinion columnist David French. I want to start with the Hill. A lot of the reporting that I just cited there comes from Punchbowl News. Jake, what is your sense, and we can take them one by one, but what's your sense of the totality of Trump's nominees? Is anybody going to find themselves in the same position that Matt Gaetz did?
You said it right, Katie. At this point, it doesn't look like that. Now it's early. I mean, remember, it's only December. It's only December 12th. So, we'll have to see how it unfolds. And listen, a disastrous hearing in which Democrats find some sort of political or policy cudgel to divide Republicans could change the tone and tenor of this debate. Could change the tone and tenor of the nomination. But as of right now, for the folks that are up here on Capitol Hill, that's all the people you named, RFK, I believe, is starting in earnest next Monday, they do seem to be heading in the right direction. I mean, you've gotten approving comments. And listen, there's a push and pull here. The Senate has an advise and consent responsibility to give their stamp of approval to the president's nominees. But a lot of Republicans believe Donald Trump should be able to have the people that he wants in the positions that he wants them. And that's where we find ourselves. And that is true, that Trump did get a lot of these folks elected. He did not get John Thune elected. In fact, he said of John Thune that he was a rhino who should be primaried. Of course, that didn't work out. John Thune comfortably won his primary and won his general election. So that's where we find ourselves today.
Ryan, what about the realities for John Thune? Donald Trump's been pretty clear that he wants his nominees confirmed. And today when that Time Magazine interview came out, he even said that he doesn't care how it happens. He just wants them. He wants them confirmed. So if he does meet a roadblock, John Thune, with a Joni Ernst or a Susan Collins or a Lisa Murkowski on a Pete Hegseth or a Tulsi Gabbard or a Kash Patel, does John Thune stomach the idea? Does he feel open to the idea of recess appointments?
The answer to that question today, Katie, is no, until the question becomes yes. And I do think that we are in a position right now where perhaps the most compelling storyline of the next Congress is going to be this push and pull between the Republican majority in the Senate and the White House. And how willing are they to stand up to Donald Trump and fully utilize their responsibility as a constitutional balance of power and co-equal branch of government and use this advise and consent role in the way that the Constitution authored it. And I do think that John Thune is in many ways between a rock and a hard place here because he's no doubtedly going to have a ton of pressure put on him by Donald Trump to make sure these nominees are all confirmed. But he also has quite a few headstrong members of his conference who are not just going to roll over and say yes to every single thing Donald Trump does. And I think the way this confirmation process plays itself out may be a window into what we can expect that this process is going to play out through at least the first 2 years of this second term of Donald Trump. And it could foreshadow a whole number of other topics in which he's going to need Republican votes on a wide range of things. And will he always be guaranteed he's going to get them? Listen, there's no doubt that things are much better for Pete Hegseth. There's no doubt that we're getting encouraging signs for people like Tulsi Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. But we have to keep in mind they can only lose 3 votes. And for each one of these potential candidates, there is very much a universe in which they could lose 3 votes. And as Jake rightly points out, they still have to go through a hearing. They still have to go through FBI background checks. There's a lot that can happen between now and when that vote actually takes place. I'm
curious, Vaughn, about the New York Times reporting that he's got folks around him saying, listen, you can't let these senators tell you who you can have and who you cannot have. You couple that with the deep pockets that Elon Musk has and his ability, as he's promised publicly, to go on the airwaves and try to pressure these Republicans in their home states, Republicans who, have an election coming up in a couple of years, some of them. What is the strategy there? Is the strategy It's my way or the highway, and I will use my cudgel if I need to?
I was talking to somebody yesterday who was familiar with the Trump transition's view on this as of right now. And the way that it was framed to me was that it's in Donald Trump's interest to have a decent working relationship with people like Joni Ernst. And if you all but throw her off the cliff and cut off her line to the White House, she and others could pose difficult challenges for them when it comes to legislation, budget, right, other issues that are important to Donald Trump. And so if they can at least make it clear, though, that if you don't go along with this, right, that it's not going to work out for you in the long run, then, you know, the message is all but sent here. And I think that that is where, you know, I tried to shout out to Donald Trump today while we were down at the stock exchange. You know, what's your message to Republican senators, Joni Ernst? And he said, let's make a deal, and then just kept walking. And so it's clearly for him, I think, something that he is not on social media, sent any direct threats yet at this point in time, and that they're still holding out at least some hope that he doesn't have to play that.
He hasn't been playing the social media card. I mean, he has done that very frequently in the past. It's usually the way he operates. He's been pretty quiet.
Right. And it's actually interesting, really. It's like Justin Trudeau, who is the one that he's been playing tough talk with up to this point. And he's inviting President Xi to come to his inauguration. Any word there's going to be others invited? I attempted to ask him that question, too. And he said that everybody who he has invited has said that they're going to come to inauguration. I said, does that include President Xi? He goes, well, I'm not going to talk about that one here. But I think this is really, you go person by person, somebody that you would think is maybe an easier person to pick up the phone and call, like a Joni Ernst, is perhaps behind the scenes not getting quite the same warm reception as others.
So, David, you are a Republican. A lot of these picks that Donald Trump has made for his cabinet line up very much with the Republican establishment. They're not folks that are going to have a hard time getting confirmed, but there are a handful, and we keep putting their names out there: Kash Patel, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., even Pete Hegseth. That don't align with the Republican establishment. Donald Trump is not Republican establishment as we used to know it. He's now the new version of that, the MAGA version of Republican establishment. So how much of what we're seeing in the Senate is a deference to what a president normally gets, which is the people that they want around them? How much of it is personal opinion that these people are going to be okay? And how much of it is pressure from MAGA, pressure from the deep pockets of somebody like Elon Musk?
Well, when it comes to Hegseth, when it comes to RFK, when it comes to Gabbard, what we are dealing with is a pressure campaign. And, you know, this pressure campaign has a single message, which constitutional conservatives should know to reject immediately. And that message is Trump won. He gets his team. But that is not what the founding fathers envisioned with the advice and consent responsibility that the Senate has. I mean, this is a party that's supposed to be able to quote the Federalist Papers, right? And Federalist number 76, Alexander Hamilton writes that the advice and consent authority is, quote, an excellent check upon a spirit of favoritism in the president and would tend greatly to prevent the appointment of unfit characters. Look, RFK, Gabbard, Hegseth, these are loyalty picks. These are reward picks. This is the favoritism of the president for unfit characters. This is exactly when the Senate is supposed to step forward and fulfill its constitutional responsibility. And Trump's response is not a constitutional argument. It's a power argument. I won, might makes right, but that's not the constitutional structure.
What is your sense, David, of what the next, if I'm not going to go 4 years, what the next year is going to look like with Donald Trump, how he's going to come in? Because it does feel a little bit different than 2016, the transition into 2017. Donald Trump was very much out there, very loud. He was having this parade of people come to see him in Bedminster and Mar-a-Lago, or Trump Tower, excuse me. This time, you know, he's ringing the bell at the NASDAQ this morning. It doesn't seem like there is as much pushback against him as there certainly was the first time he got elected.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the reason is that he not only won the Electoral College, he won in the popular vote. He doesn't have a majority of the popular vote, but he had more votes than Kamala Harris. And so I think that that's created a sense that in 2016, a lot of people saw him as, well, this was an aberration. He was the product of the Electoral College system, not the will of the people. Now you don't have that argument anymore. And so you're having to address the fact that he won more in the popular vote. He won more in the Electoral College. What does this say about us? And what kind of resistance is actually feasible and wise? And so I think a lot of people are kind of pressing the pause button to wait to see how things unfold. And that's not going to be all that predictable because Trump doesn't have an ideology so much as he has a lot of vanity. And so what is going to be in his self-interest is how he's going to act early in his presidency.